Downing Street's called on the House of Lords to help pass the government's Rwanda plan so Rishi Sunak can hit his target of having deportation flights off the ground by Easter. Last night, MPs in the Commons voted down all 10 amendments to the bill made by peers seeking to water down the controversial legislation. The bill now goes back to the Lords tomorrow, and it's being reported Labour peers will again try and reinsert 5 or 6 of the proposed changes. The so-called parliamentary ping-pong could further delay the Prime Minister's timeline, but Number 10 says Rishi Sunak is keen to act quickly. Well, joining me now in the studio, political commentator Jonathan Liss and former advisor to Michael Gove, Charlie Rowley. Thank you both for being here. I mean, we kind of expected this, Johnny, didn't we?
Yes, I mean, because what you saw was the Supreme Court basically saying that Rwanda wasn't a safe country. Now Parliament has gone against that. This is not in any Conservative manifesto. The House of Lords is conventionally only tied by manifesto commitments. So the House of Lords will be perfectly within its constitutional right and norm to vote this whole thing down. It doesn't seem as though Labour is prepared to explode the whole thing, but certainly there is a very, very sort of strongly held belief in the Lords that you shouldn't be asserting facts within law, and that actually the separation of powers in this country exists for a reason, and if the Supreme Court says something, then you shouldn't be inventing new laws to kind of contradict the Supreme Court to get around it. So these are quite solid principles, and a lot of Conservative peers are siding with that view. It's not just a party political issue.
Yeah, and it's not a kind of some fly-by-night belief, is it? This is a deeply sort of empirically held value system that you place your trust in the Supreme Court because it's the highest court in the land. And if the Supreme Court rules that actually Rwanda is probably not a safe place to send people, you take that as a highly researched and judicious judgment, and you stick with it. You don't try and derail it. Isn't that right?
Well, I think that is fair, but the point of Parliament is to make the laws of the land, and it wants to get through a bill that hopefully deters people coming into this country illegally, and if you do come into this country illegally, you get deported. That is a number one priority for the government. It's a number one priority from the Prime Minister. It's a number one issue that we hear about time after time, summer after summer, about those thousands of people that make that crossing into Britain illegally. This is just trying to get something done where no other Home Secretary, no other Prime Minister seems to have been able to grapple this issue. And so therefore I think it is a disgrace that Labour are trying to do all that they can to stop this policy, which is so important to the British public.
You don't mean that, Charlie.
I do. I do.
You're just.
I've never heard Charlie use the word disgrace before. It's not something, I must say, it's not something he does lightly, as far as I'm aware.
You're very gamely and valiantly defending a party line. You don't need to. You're not an MP. You know as well as I do that this policy is not only destined to fail, it's a complete shambles from start to finish. It's also morally repulsive. And the point is that even in the best case scenario, there are only ever going to be a few hundred people at most who will be deported. And, you know, the government's not even agreeing at the moment to exempt Afghan sort of translators from the people who could be deported.
Shall we take that as our bottom line on this conversation? And shall we say, how many people do we think, if Rishi Sunak's flights take off, and we know he wants them to, and Suella Braverman's been dreaming of hearing those wheels roaring down the runway for months and months, and nothing's happened. So, you know, everybody wants her to be happy, obviously. And so let's imagine that Rishi's dream comes true, and Suella's dream comes true, the fantasy comes true, and the planes take off with people and take them to Rwanda. What is the top limit, the number of people that will actually be accommodated there? What kind of accommodation is there for how many people? Seriously.
Well, there hasn't been a number put in, and I think James Cleverly, the Home Secretary, has said that the number can obviously increase because you can have a further deal with Rwanda, but you've got to get this.
But the deal that we've got now, the deal that exists now, isn't it 1,000 people?
I think it's about 1,000, something
I heard
500.
People are saying it's 1,000 people. And how many people have we got waiting and waiting here to be processed? Isn't it 40,000 or more people?
This is exactly the point.
So isn't the whole thing a kind of such an infinitesimal non-solution to an enormous and growing problem, and very expensive, and highly controversial, and despised by some people as utterly immoral as well? Isn't it one of these things that, from every particular, is doomed, partly because it's too small in its scope, not too big, but too small anyway? So it's pretty pointless anyhow. So the whole thing is kind of defeated before it's really started, isn't it?
Well, I think you just said it there, Vanessa. It is a growing problem, but it is only going to continue to grow if you don't have anything in place to try and deal with it.
But it's not as if you could just have anything in place. You know, something
must be done.
Something that will sift, 1,000 people away from a 40,000 plus growing problem. That's almost not worth doing because it's so small, so controversial, so expensive, so morally questionable that it's barely worth it. If it would take 25,000 people and put them somewhere else, and people could say, look at the enormous inroads being made, look at the money being saved over here, and look how it all adds up financially, and this is a really great idea. Look, 25,000 people were here, they're not here now. But 1,000 people, why is it even worth
Because
discussing?
of the Charlie's talks about the Terent Effect, but there's no evidence the Terent Effect will even take place, will even sort of happen. And when Israel tried this policy, it just ended in disaster, and all the people who went to Rwanda basically ran away from Rwanda, and the policy was exposed to failure. You're meant to learn from other countries' mistakes, not implement them yourself.
Well, on its own, I don't think anyone is saying that Rwanda on its own is going to be it's increasing the number of people, a border force that you have, increasing the agreements that you have with France. We've obviously bung them a load of money to try and stop.
So that the people who are here already can work while they're waiting to be processed, and also violently speeding up the processing
and allowing safe and legal
protocol.
routes for people to come here. The reason that the government is engaging in the most immoral fiction by saying if you come here illegally, you'll be deported to Rwanda, but not allowing people to come here legally. Obviously, the only definition of illegal is when the government says something is illegal. But the whole reason that people are coming on boats, no one wants to come on a boat, is because they're not allowed to come on registered vehicles to this country in order to claim asylum, which is an internationally recognised right. What the government is really trying to do, we don't talk about this enough, is effectively criminalising the right to asylum, and that is the big story here.
Well, I don't think that's true, but
it is true.
Well, no, because we have agreements with Afghanistan, with Syria,
well,
with
a few hundred people have come from Afghanistan under that scheme, and Ukraine is the only country where that's worked. If you come, and Hong Kong,
Don't you think the most pressing problem is the people who are already here? And the fact that they are just plugged up in this horrible logjam where they have to wait, they can't work, they're very expensive for everybody to pay for, to look after, and nobody wants to pay for them to be here for ages and ages while they're processed. And there are plenty of people in this country who aren't in work at the moment and could presumably be trained or coached to be part of the process that would speed all of this up. And there doesn't seem to be any will at the Home Office whatsoever just to get it going. You think, if Richard Branson were in charge of it, he'd get it going. You think that if you got Alan Sugar in charge of it, he'd get it going. Anybody with the will to make it happen could process people far, far more quickly. And we had this extraordinary story last week, which is of people begging to go home. They've been so, desperately frustrated, unhappy, marginalised and wretched here while waiting for somebody to tell them they could do something. It's hell, isn't it?
Well, again, I think that goes to the very first question that we were talking about, because, is there the will? And this seems to be a government and the Prime Minister that is trying all that it can to get things done, to try. The Home Office, we know for years have had problems with processing people and failed in terms of illegal migration. So doing something like this, I don't think anybody would wake up in the morning and think, aha, yes, I want to have a Rwanda scheme.
Well, actually, but it is there are some people in the Conservative Party who would like that.
Because the problem has existed for such a long period of time that obviously you have to take extreme measures to tackle an extreme problem. And I think, where is the will? It's certainly not in the House of Lords, because they're trying to block, and it's Labour peers that are trying to block a Conservative government trying to do something that the British people
something
want.
Morally repulsive.
But, I'm frequently honoured by the presence of Michael Crick in the studio, and he's an eminent and venerable and exceptionally well-informed political commentator, and repeatedly he says here, well, there isn't anything else. They have to do this because there isn't anything else. As if that suffices. Yeah. Just there isn't anything else. So we'll do this expensive, impractical, constantly thwarted, constantly impeded thing. We'll do this because there isn't anything else. That can't be good enough.
It's not good enough.
Can't be good enough, can it?
If you had the right to process asylum claims in France, for example, that would eliminate a lot of the problem in one go. If you allowed people to come on registered vehicles, as I said a moment ago, that would obviate the problem as well. The government's not willing to do any of that because it doesn't want to appear soft on migration. So instead, it is sort of devising this incredibly wicked plan and sort of neo-imperialistic plan to kind of sort of dump people.
Well, let's give Charlie a chance just to have a go at that.
Because the two things that people will always say is that if you're, and I don't think everybody is seeking asylum, actually, a lot of people that come across on those boats are economic migrants.
75% of people who claim asylum asylum are given asylum.
And 90% of those men that come across those boats from Albania are returned back. So you need more returns agreements with other countries where people come from. You need to actually make sure that people, before even getting to France, because it's a massive migration problem through Europe. It's not, we're doing relatively okay, which I know will be alarming to viewers and listeners. But the situation in Italy, the situation in Greece, the situation in Germany is far worse
that's
than
partly
than what
geography.
is.
It's
Well, that's
partly
but you
because we've
can't
got
keep
the channel in the
outsourcing
way.
the problem to countries to your right.
Well, but people should absolutely be allowed to seek asylum, if they are asylum seekers, as you say, in their first country of safety, which
Well,
could
you
be
wouldn't
any
be
other
saying that.
country
If
up
that was a
to
country
up
to
to
the
the
west
UK.
of
Isn't the
Britain that were coming
situation,
here,
though,
you
in
wouldn't be saying
terms
that.
of partly the climate and climate change, so that areas of the world are now being rendered uninhabitable and people are going to have to shift and already shifting, and partly because of the highly volatile political situation in terms of war erupting all over the place. I'm constantly sitting here with Robert Fox, the defence editor of the Evening Standard, telling me it's about to break out here and break out there and God knows what. So aren't we inevitably going to be faced with more and more and more people who, for reasons, very varied reasons, are going to want to come here because they don't want to or can't stay where they are, just physically can't?
Well, I think I'm sure that's true, but you can't just allow thousands of people, whether it's illegally or legally, to come into the country because you don't have the infrastructure.
Well, in a way, you hit the nail on the head. The government's a massive distraction, isn't it? Because a tiny minority of the number of people coming to this country are, in fact, coming on the boats. The government would have you believe that the problem is the boats because it wants to distract people from the record numbers of people who are coming here legally through visas and so on. But it's much easier for them to focus on the boats because that's where they think they have a chance.
When the figures for
migration.
legal migration were released last year, people were absolutely up in arms. They assumed that all those people had arrived on boats, which of course they hadn't at all, but they were still thoroughly affronted when they heard what the figure was. The figure was gigantic and that was legal. So God knows where we're going with this. Gentlemen, thank you both very much indeed. We'll watch, of course, very carefully and see what happens with the Prime Minister and his Rwanda scheme.